Hi, I'm Ben Felder, editor-in-chief at Investigate Midwest. Joining me is Investigate Midwest senior reporter Sky Chadde. Sky, how's it going today?
I'm good, Ben. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, and looking forward to talking to you about this big story that you had first published in July, taking a look at Brooke Rollins, the U.S. Ag Secretary, her tenure, her first kind of 6 months in office since being named President Trump's Agriculture Secretary. And I know you've been covering USDA and Rollins since, since she started, since the new administration to come into office. But I remember those early days. We kind of talked about this idea for this story and really wanting to have. I think we originally talked about like the first 100 days, but then just kind of extended past that. But really wanted to have something that took a look at what her early tenure at USDA looked like and the impact it was having. And so before we get into kind of what you're reporting uncovered, I'm curious, can you talk a little about kind of how you approached this story, and trying to look at USDA and the agency under the control of Rollins?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I'd probably go back to even before the election because anytime there's a change in the president, that's going to mean changes in policy. And so we had, under your direction, we had started talking about, if Harris had won, what that could look like, what kinds of stories could there be? If Trump won, what could that look like? What kind of stories could there be? Obviously, going from Biden to Trump, probably bigger changes, and that's pretty much exactly what we've been seeing. But the impetus, I think, started there. Is like, and then once Trump was elected, it was like, okay, how are we going to approach this? So for me, I think this reporting really got underway in February, the day that Brooke Rollins was sworn in as the Agriculture Secretary. That's when a lot of like jobs were cut. People received letters saying that they were fired. Um, that's also when a lot of funding was cut. Programs, organizations that had been receiving USDA funds for years got letters saying that their organization no longer aligns with the USDA's goals on certain things, such as DEI. Um, so that's obviously was a huge that was a huge story. And as soon as that happened, I started noticing that on LinkedIn, a lot of these employees who were laid off were sharing their stories. They were, I think, understandably um, upset at the change. Just a very human reaction to losing your job. No matter what you think of whether the government needs to be downsized or not, these are real people with families, children. um, some of them had just moved to a new place, put a down payment on a house, and now their income was suddenly, you know, gone. So just they were having very human reactions to that. So I started reaching out to them over LinkedIn, and just tried to talk to as many folks who are going through this as possible. And in addition to what they were going through, also wanted to know what they were doing and what they thought would happen if someone was going to stop doing the work that they were doing. And so from there, it just evolved into, okay, we're trying to talk to as many USDA employees as possible. And I mean, we'll talk to anyone who's had any affiliation. So people who were fired and weren't brought back, um, people who had not been fired and are still there, political appointees from previous administrations. Some of the best sources have been people who have worked there for decades and recently left, and kind of worked their way up the ranks. They can just provide perspectives across Democratic and Republican administrations. And when you talk to them, the kind of thing that stands out to me is just how different this Trump 2, the approach under Trump 2 is how different it is from even Trump 1 and previous administrations. For instance, if you look at a place like APHIS, which is um, which helps keep invasive pests out of um, the country, and helps shut down things like New World screwworm, invasive flies, that kind of thing. Those that agency has pretty much not been targeted for rifts or budget cuts. Both Republican and Democrats have recognized that this is a very important thing for food and national security. But with Doge and the new people at USDA, um, they had a lot of people get cut. I think it was about 15% of the workforce. So after February 14th, that's what we did. We just kept trying to find more and more people to talk to. There were lawsuits against the administration, um, and we um, read all of those. There were emails between administration staff and people who had received grants. Those were pretty enlightening. Um, so I was just trying to find as much pieces of information as possible over these first 6 months to try to get an idea of what was going on and what the potential long-term impact of these cuts could be. Um, and once um, we started reporting this story that came out in July in earnest, another factor was that we started reaching out to experts to try to understand if this particular part of the agency, of the department, has fewer people or its funding gets cut, what could that mean moving forward? So it was all trying to talk to just as many different people as possible, try to get as many different perspectives as possible to make sure that we're not missing anything. And then, yeah, just trying to get another part of this was also trying to understand where Brooke Rollins is coming from, who she is. And a lot of that, we did request an interview. I never received an email back when I requested an interview. And I think I requested one maybe at least several weeks before the story ran. You know, we do want to try to give people just as much time as possible when it comes to comes to these things. Um, But because we weren't able to talk to her, I had to go a different route. But luckily, she's written a ton over the years. She's given a lot of interviews since she's been Ag Secretary. And we were able to kind of piece together through all of those interviews where she's coming from, how she might view the federal workforce, her thoughts on the agriculture industry in general. So a lot of it was just that, was just trying to figure out where she's coming from, and then also just trying to talk to as many people who are affected by her decision making as possible.
Yeah, yeah, and it was great reporting. I mean, you talk about the sources of employees that are still at USDA or have recently been let go, and obviously that informed this Rollins piece. But I know you had several stories in the lead up to that I think readers could find under your byline page on our website. But the importance of that is really kind of, like you said, kind of getting to know really what the work is that they do. It's not just about, 15% of people were cut from this agency, but when you can talk to those people about the real work they do, it kind of puts a different lens on it. And again, whether or not you think that the government needs to be downsized or not, having that information about kind of what those specific tasks are and what the role is. And I think, you even had the story previously about an agency that invests in rural communities. And I think there are some programs that on the surface, people might say like, well, what does this really have to do with agriculture? And I think your story did a good job of really kind of showing, what this program did to benefit, all people living in rural communities, but especially the farming community as well. Talking about Brooke Rollins, this is obviously the second Trump term. There's a lot of differences between the second term and the first term. It it kind of struck me in your reporting just either the lack of experience that she had in the ag sector, or at least just kind of the unique path that she took to it as ag secretary, maybe compared to predecessors. And obviously, Sonny Perdue was, Trump's ag sec in his first term, probably more of a traditional, resume, what you'd expect for that position. But so a little different for her, and it seemed like that she really is kind of a for lack of a better phrase, a true believer in kind of Trump's kind of MAGA agenda and movement. And so, talk a little bit about the power that she has at USDA, but also as the secretary, she's obviously following the lead of the administration. She came in at a time when Elon Musk's Doge was making cuts, when downsizing federal agencies was like the main focus. She's had to navigate the president's major moves on tariffs and immigration. I mean, how much power does she have, and how much of it is her trying to navigate the direction that the president is trying to go when it comes to the ag industry?
I think that's a good question. There are definitely things that I think indicate that a lot of the big changes at USDA are probably happened before she got there or were in the works before she got there. But I also think she is in complete alignment with a lot of these things that are happening. So, for instance, when it comes to Doge, there was a one of the leaders of Doge who has worked with Elon Musk before. he was deposed as part of a lawsuit. And as part of the long transcript, he says that on February 13th, before Rollins was sworn in, he was talking with the chief of staff at the USDA about firing employees. And so that process was already underway. And based on that transcript of that deposition, the leadership at USDA before Rollins was there had submitted a plan to fire all these people. This is the probationary employees that were first laid off on February 14th at the USDA. So when Rollins first is sworn in, her first comments to staff are, "We want Doge here. We fully support Doge." She says, "I'm going to set the example um, for everyone when it comes to working with Doge. Everyone needs to be completely transparent with Doge." So, but then so I think she's in complete alignment with everything. And she worked in the first Trump administration as a policy advisor in the White House. Um, but I think there are also things that maybe show, um, and I think there's competing interests within the Trump administration. But another Doge example is there's a guy named Gavin Kliger. I think that's how you pronounce the last name, Kliger or Kliger, who's in his mid-20s, graduated from Berkeley, and he was leading up the initiative to uh, review all the funding to make sure that it fit with the Trump administration's new agenda. So they were flagging words that had like diversity, climate, uh, queer, class, all these kinds of things that they thought no longer fit with Trump's agenda. And so he was in charge of that. And another email that surfaced in the lawsuit was where he's saying that he's essentially saying, I think we need to cut more funding than had originally been planned. I think we need to raise our goal. And in that email, he says something to the effect of, "I'm working up a memo for Rollins' signature today. I called her. She's all on board with this." Um, so again, whether Rollins I think Rollins is in complete agreement with all of this, but is she leading the charge? I think that's an open question. Now, I will say that when we asked about that, the USDA pushed back very hard. And they said that to imply that Rollins is not in charge of everything is hearsay, essentially.
And that's, I mean, obviously when the president appoints his cabinet, and it makes sense that they would follow his lead. They do have obviously some control over their agency and the day-to-day stuff. And so, I know you and I were talking about this through kind of just your reporting and the editing process. Is like, she is a little bit of a at the whim of what the president wants, right? And not that a cabinet secretary couldn't come out and disagree with the president. It's happened a few times in the history of the country, but it doesn't usually end well, and it's not usually a tactic that the secretary takes. And so I think one of the things that really came across in your reporting is she kind of came into this kind of, I think, fair to say, turbulent landscape, and it's trying to navigate that. Yeah, I wanted to go back to a point that you made about just kind of the terms that were being flagged, and trying to root out grants that they didn't think were core to the mission, and were, maybe under the umbrella of DEI. I know there was one case where they were looking for the word tracking, and specifically where the Gavin who you had mentioned was talking about tracking the exact carbon output of soybeans or soybean yields does not provide a direct benefit to farmers. That's what he wrote. And then, as your reporting shows, I mean, obviously that's a big importance to soybean farmers. And so there is a little bit of a, especially from some of those officials from Doge coming in, that just maybe didn't have quite a grasp on the ag sector, and it created some problems when they were trying to decide how to, maybe flag grants and other programs to cut.
Yeah, for sure. I think what Elon Musk and Doge and Trump would probably argue is that having people from the outside and having people coming in with no information,
Mhm.
right? Just coming in from an outsider's perspective and analyzing things and making sure, okay, is this really the way we want it to work? I think in some cases that is very valuable to have this outsider's perspective. Um, I'm not sure exactly. if they were truly trying to understand everything that was going on, and how things actually operated. That is not the impression I got from speaking to USDA employees. Um, and to your point, yeah, when Gavin sent that email, he said, let's include tracking in this list of words. And his point was, we don't need to track the exact carbon output from soybeans. Now, if you're a farmer, if you work in ag, you know that understanding how much carbon is coming off your field is very important. And just setting aside climate change and all that, it's just if you can retain nitrogen in your soil, um, or carbon in your soil, that means your soil is much healthier,
Mhm.
which means you can increase yields. It just makes you a much more productive farmer. And so, not understanding that, I think for many is a big red flag. And I think it does put into question, okay, are the people who are making decisions at the USDA, do they truly understand the work of the USDA and the agriculture industry? One thing also as a part of that, I think is important to note that Rollins has said that all of her hiring at the USDA will be based on merit. Um, I don't have any insight into this. Gavin Kleiger worked for Doge, and different Doge people are assigned to different agencies. He's worked at different agencies like the CB, like the Consumer Protection Bureau, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So I'm not sure if she was involved in his hiring or not, but she has said that anyone who works at USDA will work at USDA because of merit. And we have asked about him and why he was hired there. We didn't get any answers, or we haven't received any answers yet. Um, but I think that's just important to note that she is saying that everyone's there on merit. But I do think him not understanding the importance of soil health does raise questions about what meritocracy means at the USDA right now.
Yeah, no, definitely. Good point. Um, again, we talked about at the beginning, a new administration comes in, is always going to bring change, especially when it goes from one party to the next. And every major agency in the federal government is going to go through this transition period, and there's going to be new things. And I think it's fair to say, obviously, with the Trump administration, we saw this the first term, and the second term. I mean, that change is just accelerated. There's a lot more, again, using this word, kind of disruption. I think that's fair to say. And no matter what you cover, our fellow journalists on other beats, their particular federal agency is going to go through a lot of change. It strikes me that, for us, it covers agriculture and USDA, that some of the biggest things going on right now in the Trump administration have a direct impact with the agriculture sector, whether you're talking about the trade war, immigration, climate change, and the pushback on science. I mean, even the Maha movement and food standards. I mean, you could argue, I think, that USDA is going through some of the most change right now under this new administration. And so your story did a great job of kind of laying the groundwork for who Rollins is and how she's kind of established herself at USDA. As we wrap up, what are you looking at going forward? I mean, what's going to be interesting to you to track in the weeks, the months, and years to come if she's still in this position?
Yeah, I think one of the important things, and we are working on a story about this, and we have it in the works, is her approach to race and gender
Mm.
at the USDA. They have said there's been a lot of focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Rollins and Trump and Musk argue that these are all very wasteful. These are wasting taxpayer dollars. And specifically when it comes to Rollins, she says they're wasteful because they're not going to farmers. Um, um, the amount of money they've cut is only in the couple hundred millions. Um, and at the same time, they are proposing about 60 billion in subsidies to the largest farms. Um, so that's kind of an interesting dynamic there. Um, the New York Times had a good story about that recently. Other things I'm looking at, I think a big thing is things like New World Screwworm that is getting closer to Texas. Kevin Shea, who worked at the USDA for more than 40 years and was the APHIS administrator for Obama, Trump 1, and Biden until he recently left the agency, has said that with the 15% cuts to APHIS, um, That's going to make it at the very least extremely hard for the agency to prevent New World screwworm from entering the U.S. Just with less staff, um, it's just gonna there's less oversight, there's less people um, monitoring the situation. Um, the USDA has announced plans to address it, um, and they're opening up a new facility on the US-Mexico border that will basically produce sterile flies that could then reproduce, but nothing actually happens with the New World screwworm, which is how they traditionally like manage this pest. But other things like that, like beyond New World screwworm, how is that going to address? How are they going to address situations like this? Another thing is bird flu. That's still very much a thing. Egg prices have decreased. There's obviously more eggs available now, but bird flu still is happening. It's still out there. So that's just going to be an ongoing issue for them to deal with. Um, um, I mean, other things I think just in general is um, how is the reorganization? They announced a big reorganization recently where they're going to move a lot of the DC staff out to regional hubs. One's in Indiana, I think one's in the South, one's in Salt Lake City, one is in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I think it's good to note that they did that without notifying Congress. And there was a hearing where both members of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, did not like that they did that. And there were a lot of questions from Republicans saying that, I didn't know you were going to close this office in my state. And this is an economic generator. So they had to answer those questions. So I think figuring out how this reorganization is going to play out, who is going to be affected the most, how it's going to affect agriculture moving forward. There was just a story recently that this reorganization is going to close the only Forest Service office in Montana. Obviously, Montana has lots of forest. I'm sure they will argue that this is efficient and that not having that office there doesn't mean they won't be able to provide services. But without boots on the ground, I think there is a question of whether or not you can provide those services. So those are kind of the big things. Like there's just major changes going on, a loss of institutional knowledge, and just think, you know, at any job, if you lose senior leadership, you lose people who've been there for a long time. It's just there's at the very least going to be a transition period that affects the job, the services you're trying to provide. Um, and so just seeing how that will actually affect the agriculture industry and farmers moving forward, that's what we'll be paying attention to.
Yeah, those are important topics that definitely will be following. And I think, one of the reasons why we focus on kind of, in journalism, like the first 100 days of an administration is because obviously a newly elected president has some momentum and, kind of an edict to govern and not that everyone just goes along with it, but especially when your party is in power, you do have the ability to get some things done. And I don't think that there's been any necessarily signs that the party is breaking with Trump. But my point is that we are kind of entering this new phase where a lot of those changes that you've reported on are starting to now become real. Not that some of them do have an instant impact, but now some of them are starting to kind of hit states. A lot of key red states where we are seeing some Republican lawmakers start to say like, hey, maybe this isn't the direction we want to go, or maybe we don't want to do this. And again, that's not to say I don't think we're at a point where we see some kind of open revolt in the party, but I just think that some of these these impacts again with, trade and immigration, we are starting to see more lawmakers that have now lived with some of these changes for several months start to say like, okay, here's the impact that I'm seeing in my home state, and maybe we need to go about this a different way. And so I think that'll definitely be an important theme to continue to follow. So, well, hey, Sky, thanks so much for explaining a little bit more about your reporting into the early months of Brooke Rollins, Trump's ag secretary. We're going to put a link to that article if you're watching on YouTube. It'll be in the link below, along with your author page, which has a lot of great reporting from the early days of Rollins and the impact on USDA. So, hey, Sky, thanks so much.